So it's just an honor to have Bishop Matera here on our Out Front. Our Out Front is really to highlight those who are on the front line, and that's really our dominion mandate given to us by the Lord to be on the front line. And Bishop Matera is definitely one on the front line. He has a podcast on iTunes and most major platforms called The Joseph Matera Show. He does weekly, and he's also writes weekly articles for Charisma and different outlets. And so he tends to touch all the topics that are currently going on in our world with a biblical perspective. And the last 5 or 6 weeks, he's been writing regarding the race crisis that's going on. It has been going on for a long time, but it's definitely in the surface of what we're talking about, and many churches are talking about. So just looking over a lot of his articles, there's definitely a lot he has to share regarding what we've been sharing about on the radio for the last few weeks. And so, Bishop Joe, I see right from the beginning, you started writing this on June 2nd, and the first article you wrote was How Our National Crisis Exposed Human Depravity. And the next article as well, a plea to my friends to the left and to the right. So we see how divided our nation is during times like this. And you wrote, really, when it comes down to it, our only hope as a nation regarding these race issues or any issue is the gospel of Jesus Christ. The problem really is sin. So I'd just like you to elaborate more on that. And just again, thank you for being with us.
Sure. Well, I'm blessed to be with yourself and Bishop Gandy, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the work that the both of you are doing in reaching your whole region for Christ. I thank God that He has put us together. Well, I've been on the front lines of trying to bring ethnic reconciliation in the New York City area, at least since the early 1990s. So it's an issue near and dear to my heart. And I met with a young black intellectual for several months in the early 90s so he could teach me how to think in a way that would be sensitive and understanding of the African American context. Because being brought up in an Irish Italian neighborhood, even though I didn't think I was prejudiced, there was a lot of things I wasn't aware of. And one of the most profound things this young man told me was that in order for us, meaning the African Americans, to survive and thrive, we have to study the majority culture. But you guys don't have to study us. So we almost know more than you about yourselves. And that's why I needed a download from him to understand things. So I've been on a journey for many years out of my love for the body of Christ and its different expressions and colors. And I am convinced, with knowing people from many different ethnicities and myself included, as my mother was born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. My father's Italian, but we have French, English, Greek ethnicities in us as well. My wife is Lebanese and Polish. So just being sensitive to the different realities of different ethnic groups has been a joy for me. And that is why I've been writing on these issues. And I'm convinced that all ethnic people have the same issues. When you humanize instead of categorize people, you will find that they have the same heart, basically the same needs. And so the differences are only skin deep, even though we have different cultural appetites and proclivities. It doesn't mean that one supposed race is inferior or superior. It just means that we have different things that we live by in terms of our cultural context. And the bottom line is the gospel is the only hope for all of us. We're all in the same boat. We all are born in sin. That's why I wrote my article on human depravity. That's original sin. That's why I wrote to my friends on the left and to the right, because when we band together based on mere politics and ideology, we miss the heart of the gospel. When Jesus taught us the Beatitudes, before we could be the salt of the earth and light of the world, he tells us in Matthew 5, we have to show empathy, we have to mourn, we have to be meek, we have to have mercy. So it's not just about public policy and righteousness. You have three passages before the passage on righteousness, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, that have to do with a attitude, having the proper humility and the proper heart for other people. So it's not just having the right politics that matters. So even if we don't agree politically, it doesn't mean we can't love the other or humanize them or even partner with them. So that's why I'm writing these articles and trying to give a biblical perspective. My latest article, which came out yesterday, people could go to josephmatera.org, is I show how the color issue is not the real crisis. And I get into history and show how there have been slavery, whites enslaving other whites. Right now, there are more blacks enslaving other blacks than we almost had in American slavery in certain parts of Africa. And so it's not just a color issue, it's a power issue, it's a sin issue, it's an economic issue. And it all goes down to sin. And so we need to be redeemed by the blood of Christ so that we could love each other and we could live a life where we put other people in their interest as equal to ours. And that can only come as a miracle of God through conversion.
Excellent, and agreed. I had a chance to peruse through some of your writings, the ones that you referenced here as it relates to these particular topics. And I think for the most part, I agree. But you make the point of expressing that differentiating between the issue as it relates to public policy and politics and all that, and the issue as it relates to the church or the body of Christ, and those are two very distinct issues. And I often say that we have two. So we're on the challenge is on two fronts. One is the challenge of the church in terms of its spirituality and its biblical mandate, and the other is the challenge that we have of confronting some of the issues that we're talking about in America presently from the legislative and public policy side of things. Would you agree with that? And how would you articulate that if you do?
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree. We have a sin issue, which is individual, and that has to do with, in terms of what we're dealing with the last 3 months, would be racism when it comes to civil unrest. And so racism is an attitude of the heart. But when enough people in power share that view of racism, then it becomes systemic, resulting in discriminatory laws. Now, even though I would say that America is probably one of the least racist countries in the world today, this is why so many people want to come into this country. And there were long fought battles, not just the Civil War, but the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-20th century that successfully eradicated a lot of these systemic racist laws having to do with segregation and having to do with other issues related to equity and equality in voting, education. If the law is applied arbitrarily by a racist individual who's in power, then you could still have de facto racism. And so it is true the gospel heals the human heart, but that doesn't mean that we don't do something systemically in terms of having the right laws or doing what people are doing in terms of police reform. There's definitely reform needed. I'm not a proponent of abolishing or defunding the police, especially not abolishing it. But I am a proponent of police reform, which could be another podcast altogether. But it doesn't mean that the laws themselves are racist. But if there are racists who represent the law, they can, as I said already, arbitrarily apply the law So they may favor, for example, a white person over a black person, even though the law is the same for both. It doesn't mean that there is equal treatment. And so, in terms of the racist issues, only Jesus can heal that heart. Laws won't change the human heart. But in terms of discrimination, if there is any discrimination in laws, then we not only get saved, but we also have to do our part in changing the law. So I make a slight distinction between racism and discrimination. Racism's individual, inner heart. Discrimination is more in public policy. So that's how I would apply that.
Now, I would, if I would suggest that racism. I think you've already indicated that racism is indeed a has to do with economics. It's an economic system. It's a system of oppression that is designed to and intended to have one race, the black race, oppressed. In America, you mentioned earlier too that you said America is probably the least racist nation, and that's why many people want to come here. And that's probably true. People want to come here, but the people who are the oppressed in America are the ones who have the descendants of slaves who have been here. So that's where the oppression is targeted. So people coming here because it's good. And unfortunately, here's the issue. It is good and better for immigrants than it is and has been for descendants of slaves. And so I think it depends on the perspective as to whether or not, how great we feel that it is.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Again, I can't live in the skin of somebody else, so I can't argue with somebody else's experiences. I could only have empathy and validate it and see how we could make this world better. But I would say even a lot of people from Africa, if they had a chance, would move here in spite of some of the challenges, because there are so many more economic opportunities here than they would have. And I've been to many countries in Africa. So I would say that even though we still have issues with racism and oppression, I still think that the U.S. probably has a better system, and the fact that we elected the first black president shows that we've come a long way. It doesn't mean that we don't have issues. We obviously have issues of racism. As I said, it's arbitrarily applied. Even if the laws are better, it doesn't mean there's equal treatment. In certain communities, even I wouldn't want to be caught in a store in certain communities with my accent and my license plate. So it definitely is a tough situation in many places in America. And I definitely think that the police have to have a definitely cultural shift. So, yeah, I think that the sons and daughters of slaves, unfortunately, they were given a supposed Emancipation Proclamation in the 19th century, but that lasted no more than 10 years. And then right after that came, Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And then in the 50s, the Black Code laws that still exist today in certain places, not written laws, but codes that certain people understand. And yeah, there's still, as we can see in social media, still a lot of racism. It's crazy. It's unfortunate.
Now, you also mentioned, Josh, you can jump in. Let me do all the talking.
No, it's okay. I could see what Bishop Joe was saying. That would definitely stir you to have some questions. I want to make sure you had an opportunity to ask. Let me have you go ahead and ask what's on your heart, and then I got something to follow up with that.
So I was going to say, now you also mentioned, Bishop Joe, that you talked about racism in Africa and racism that predates white racism that is unique. And here's what I would say about the racism issue. White racism and white supremacy and the racism that comes from that line of thinking is unlike any other racist system. And it's unlike any, rather system of slavery, I should say. I'm sorry, slavery. It's unlike any other system of slavery. because it is. You pointed out in one of your writings that I read. You pointed out, the fact that there is slavery and how the scripture talks about it, how the scripture the context of it in those times and that sort of thing. The difference with white slavery is that it is it's permanent. It's based solely on race. It is unrelenting, unforgiving, and there's just no way out, that kind of thing. And that was the difference in the slavery. So I don't know that it's I always feel like it's an unfair comparison to compare racism of any other kind to the racism that is based solely on race that we've experienced in the last 400 years of so that type of racism has been unlike anything else, and it still has its grips, its fangs in the neck of America today. No pun intended. It really is just something that is just fierce and nothing like it.
Oh yeah. My article actually wasn't an article. I put out a position paper 2 weeks ago comparing biblical slavery and American slavery, and there's no comparison. Biblical slavery had to do with people being indentured servants, actually being mentored by another family if they robbed from them until they paid it back, which is a little more humane than the penal system. That's another conversation. And then they were free after they paid it back. Well, they were prisoners of war, and it wasn't based on ethnicity. There's no question about that. But American slavery would be called chattel slavery, where they actually owned you. They felt like that you were their property, and that was definitely not biblical slavery. And it's far worse. I would say there are probably some countries right now in Africa, though, whose slavery is not based on race, it's based on religion. There's Muslims taking Christians as slaves and prisoners of war, and it's probably just as bad as American slavery. So that's black on black slavery, which is still going on today, which I think Black Lives Matter people and proponents should bring that up if they're going to be consistent. And the other thing to be consistent is that the whites in Portugal and Spain, England, they received their slaves from black tribal heads. It wasn't just kidnapping them. So there has to be accountability for the African nations that sold their own people into slavery. And the slavery they had was even worse than American slavery, because from my reading, they would allow the women and children to live, but they killed a lot of the male slaves that they had several hundred years ago, 400 or 500 years ago. So again, it's not just a white supremacy thing. It's a lot of it has to do with economics. And of course, the American slave owners had to justify slavery, not just on an economic plane, because they were supposedly Christians, or at least lived in a so-called Christian country. So they had to justify it by saying that blacks were inferior, using purported passages of scripture like Genesis 9, where the Noah cursed the black race. I deal with that in my article last week, where that's a horrible misreading of scripture. And so it's very complex. I would say it's not just superiority. I think a lot of the main drivers, at least historically, has been economics, which is the height of narcissism and self-focus. You could argue that that's just as bad a reason as thinking one race is superior over another. So, yeah, it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, it's very complex, and I don't know that, and I don't like to conflate. I like to, when we talk about the problem that America's facing and fixing it, I think that when we begin to talk about the other problems in other places, we just it gets in the way of having discussions that talk about bringing resolution to the problem at hand, because there are problems that we can talk about problems all day all over the world. and every family, race, and individual, and we would just kind of go in circles.
Sure.
But I think that if we're going to get to trying to bring true resolution to the issues at hand, the problem at hand, which is the issues of racism in America, the issues of police brutality, the issues of and all the other systemic types of issues that we face in America, then we have to kind of isolate the conversation, talk about how do we address that. And we talked about the fact that, of course, it's a spiritual heart issue, of course, but also if the only way it's going to be, we're going to undo the problems. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you see the problem as, are the problems that we're talking about legislative problems, legal problems? Is that where the source of the problems, is that where they originate? Is that the heart of the issue?
Well, like I said before,
Laws.
I think pre-civil rights movement, pre-LBJ, and some of the civil rights advances, I would say definitely legally there was a huge issue. In terms of now, I think it's a little more nuanced, and it wouldn't be. I think the main issue is not legal. I think it's in terms of certain issues in maybe small communities and sheriffs who have their own legal authority. It could be ways of them applying the law. I think it's more a misapplication of the law. I think it could be de facto systemic racism in terms of law because of racist police officers or politicians. And the fact that there are places that are showing the Confederate flag is an affront, is a embarrassment to this country, is incredibly offensive to even myself. I didn't even realize NASCAR was flying the flag. I didn't. And then there are parts of the South where they still think the Civil War is ongoing. And so even though we won, we defeated the South, why are they putting monuments of their heroes in this country? Why are they flying the Confederate flag, especially
Right.
if it was connected to slavery? So I find that offensive. I'm not saying I think people should forcibly take it into their own hands and pull down monuments, because then where do you end? Then they'll pull down every monument. But the idea of taking down some monuments, I'm not against that. And I think the U.S. has never fully repented for slavery. The fact of the matter is that when we fly the Confederate flag, it shows that there's a large portion of our country who wishes that they won, who wishes that they had their way in terms of the way life was for them. I can't say every one of them are racist, and I'm not saying everyone who wants to fly the Confederate flag even understands fully what that means to African Americans. Some of them probably think, oh, well, it's just part of our history, so I don't want to, brandish everybody equally. But the idea of it as connected to the history of slavery is an offense to myself. And I'm not a descendant of, perhaps I am a descendant of the slaves somehow, because my ancestry DNA says I'm part Congolese. So I don't know, maybe I am, but it's an affront to me. And I'm not even a black person, so I could imagine how the black population feels.
Not only racist, but also when it comes to here's a country where you had people who rebelled. They were rebels. They rebelled against the government. They committed treason, and there's how do you celebrate that? I mean, how do you celebrate that? Right? I mean, no other place in the world does that happen.
Yeah.
The thought of flying or hanging a swastika in Israel would be insane, right? It would be insane.
Yes.
And America still holds to that kind of thing. And if it is, and because it is a legislative problem, it has to do with some legalities and legislators and so forth and that kind of thing. Legislators who support those systems that are racist systems, I think they contribute to I would think they contribute to the problem. Legislators who support those positions, laws who in some way give cover to people who operate in systemic racism or systems and corporations and so forth. All of those things. Anyone who gives cover to that, I think are also a part of the problem.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Unfortunately, the U.S. has a two-party system, and none of the choices that we have are fully reflective of Christian values. You may have one that has certain values that is more biblical, but they're missing it totally in other values, et cetera, vice versa. So I'm very careful that I don't endorse one party, that I just preach kingdom principles. If I see somebody doing something obviously against Christian values, I may call them out, but most of the time, especially in this particular era of a polarity, I just try to bring out the principles. And because of that, I've been limited in social media. Facebook has limited my reach for the last year and a half because of my fiercely strong pro-life, sanctity of life stand, both pre-birth and post-birth. So that would include racism. But yeah, I have a hard time with political leaders who defend flying the Confederate flag. I don't understand it. I'm not sure who's talking to them. I don't know what history they're reading. It kind of baffles me. But to be fair, although it seems as though just Republicans are the ones talking about keeping the Confederate flag, if we're going to be fair in tearing down every vestige of slavery in the KKK, we could do away with the Democratic Party because they were the party of racism. They were the ones who started the KKK. Up until the early 60s, they were the ones against civil rights, and African Americans voted primarily Republican until I think it was Richard Nixon, might have been the last president to get the majority African American vote. So to be fair, you know, where does it stop to do away with certain, you know, statues or history or whatever? I have no problem with the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments, but other things, that is a little more nuanced, and I would be against giving ourselves a new nation, deconstructing the Constitution, and that's where some of this conversation could lead, because I think it's not just about George Floyd and about Black Lives Matter. I think any fool should agree, especially they're Christian, that Black Lives Matter, and we should focus on Black lives right now. Of course, all lives matter, but the blacks are the ones being assaulted. They're the ones in pain. But the Black Lives Matter organization has other agendas besides the Black lives having equality, that if you look at their website, you could see some different things that would be totally opposed to a Christian worldview. So we have to be careful. We have to have discernment to know how there's politics on both sides that would like to weaponize the issues at hand for their own advantage. And that's where we have to have clear thinkers like yourself to have discernment to see through the agendas of every person, both on the left, the right, blacks as well as whites, etc.
Josh, let me say one more thing, then you can jump in.
I know there's a lot.
So yeah. When we talk about black, because Pastor Bishop Matera is saying so much that I like to comment on, but when we talk about Black Lives Matter, you know, we often will talk about their agenda, which I disagree with much of it, as you do. But we don't hear people talk about the white conservative racist groups. We talk about the KKK, but we talk about them kind of in passing. We never really talk about them in a way of condemning them. We almost say they're a group who has the right to exist, and we don't agree with their whole politics, but we never go beyond that. In fact, I never hear any conversation about the KKK other than they're a hate group, and that's it. But if you pull back the layers and you begin to talk about the KKK, you'll talk about who they are. You'll begin to talk about policing and policemen. You talk about judges and senators and mayors and sheriffs. So when we don't dig deeper into that, I don't know how serious we are about. So there's a difference in how we talk about these groups that are racist groups and how we talk about groups that are seemingly anti-racist, but may have other agendas and other issues with which we disagree. But we treat one group differently than the other in most cases.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm soon going to come out with an article on the difference between conservatism and Christianity, as well as how nationalism can be problematic. I think if you're an ultra patriot and you wrap the gospel with the American flag, even if you're pro-life, it could be an issue. I'm first a Christian, second an American, and we have to be very, very careful that we don't just come together around a few issues. There's a lot of issues. Human nature is complex. The issues at hand are very complex. And yes, there are people on the alternate right, so to speak, who I am just as concerned about as the organization Black Lives Matter or Marxist or leftist agendas, radical feminism. There are people involved right now who are trying to incite a race riot or a civil war that are on the far right. And that is definitely detrimental, especially if conservatives blindly go along with them and don't know the root aspects of what they're doing, or if these people even call themselves Christians. I have a problem with Christians who have historically they have opposed even interracial marriage. I think that's an issue. You even have Bibles like the Dake Study Bible that seems to imply that you shouldn't mix races. And you have white fundamentalism in Christianity, not all like this, but there are some I've come across years ago. The people I'm running with now don't have, as far as I can see, this issue. But yeah, there is definitely people live in a bubble, a white bubble. You could say possibly people live in a black bubble and a Hispanic bubble that are ethnocentric. They preach an Afrocentric or a Caucasian-centric or a Latino-centric gospel. And I think it's very, very dangerous, no matter what side you're on, to do that.
And Bishop, I knew there was a lot that you wanted to respond to with what Bishop was sharing. So we actually discussed a few weeks ago the article that you wrote on negative and positive results from the present civil unrest. So since then, this issue, I've seen some very positive results. I tend to see everything as God's working through it all. Whatever the enemy's doing, he's turning it back on his head. And I've seen even in our own church, a lot of people are just being educated right now, because this issue is not in our education system. We don't discuss race much, and we don't understand our history that well, especially from African American perspective. So a lot of Caucasians are being educated, and people's perspectives are changing on both sides. What I believe we do need to do is be prepared as leaders to help people be delivered, delivered from trauma on one side and delivered from prejudiced thinking on the other side. So there's a lot of deliverance that needs to be, and I hope we're prepared for that as the church. But just enlighten a little bit more on what you're seeing, both negative and positive, and what God is doing in the midst of all that's going on in our nation and the world.
Yeah, I wrote that article a few weeks ago, so I can't remember everything I wrote, but one of the biggest things that stands out is that unlike the civil rights marches of the 1950s and 60s, that was predominantly black. When I see the protests, I see almost half and half whites, half black. So I'm really excited about that. I'm excited that young people, the millennials, Generation Z, are finally waking up to the realities of life, that they have to start thinking deeper. Whether I agree with their initial conclusions. I think, as you get older, your conclusions can be different. But I welcome critical thinking. I welcome people even challenging the status quo. I welcome young people being activated for a cause. And it's up to the church to preach the gospel to them, disciple them. I've got one young black kid in my church. I don't even think he's 19, and he's already mobilized thousands on the streets, and he's using it as a way to preach the gospel, and leading huge marches. And he's calling us up for prayer, for advice on what to say and how not to alienate those who don't know the Lord. At the same time, protest police brutality. And man, I love it. I think it's great. I think it's great that whites are being forced to hear their black brothers and sisters share their stories. They're being forced to enter into a conversation they did not have to have 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago as the majority culture. They were in the driver's seat. It's uncomfortable for certain white people to think that they're not always going to be in the driver's seat. And they have to share power. They have to share their voice. I think that's a good thing. I think God not only hates racism, he hates oppression, he hates injustice, and he wants people of all different ethnicities and expressions to have access to power, to speak, to have a voice, and not just those who have a lot of money, not just those who are great athletes, even poor people. Now social media is evening the playing field. If you have something good to say, if you have a lot of, you have something to say, I should say, some of it may not be good. You could get on social media with an iPhone and be heard by thousands. So people with the best ideas, or with the most provoking ideas, provocative ideas, I should say, will be heard, whether they have money or they have the ability to have a great studio or not. Just plug in an iPhone when you're sitting somewhere and speak into Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. So I think God can use this very powerfully, but the most excitement I have is that blacks and whites are marching together, that they're having conversation, and I'm so excited over that. I tell you, I think it's incredible.
Yeah, one other thing too is actually seeing pastors and churches involved in this, Christians being involved with this. Instead of hiding out in our own four walls, we're out in the streets. Pastor Steve at our church actually walked the bridge with one of our members of our church who was in the civil rights march, and ended up being interviewed by the news station and all that. And I thought it was just amazing to see, being on the forefront of this issue, that we're not ignoring it, pretending it's not there, but we're actually tackling it, dealing with it, talking about it. Another thing, I see a lot of relationships being formed of black and white and brown. People are wanting to connect further than just being in the same room. Being part of our multicultural church is good, but that's not enough. We need to be friends. We need to be companions. We need to work alongside each other and go to work together and appreciate each other's differences. So that's a beautiful thing. You also wrote on a lot of negatives, and that's where a lot of our discussion, when we did go over this article, especially Bishop Gandy had some questions regarding some of the negatives. I'll just read a few to remind you what you wrote. The civil unrest is exposing racism. Cities, including black and brown communities, have been decimated by mob violence. Anarchists and ultra-liberals are attempting to abolish the police force. Social justice advocates are still advocating for policies that worsen systemic poverty in at-risk communities. And fifth, extremists and self-serving leaders utilize civil unrest to further their agenda. So Bishop, could you just elaborate a little more on the negatives that's taken place?
Yeah, I mean, some of the so-called Great Society policies were good, but some of them were negative. For example, if you look at the black family before the institution of welfare in the 1960s, they had less divorce than white families. They had more stable families than white families. And unfortunately, because they had more poverty than white families, welfare, probably unintentionally, I'm hoping, although some of my black conservative friends think it was intentional, uh, divided the families because single moms were rewarded for having children without having a husband. And even in the Hispanic community in the 1980s, when I was beginning my ministry in Sunset Park, we had teenage Hispanic women who would talk about who's going to have their next baby because it would give them more money for welfare. And so it totally decimated the family unit, and it has not recovered yet. So I think, and then also some of the onerous laws related to zoning for housing, and different things because of the environment made it more expensive to build. Economist Thomas Sowell gets into this at length. He has a book called Discrimination and Disparities and other books, and I've been a student of his since the 1990s, reading his books. And incredible story of a man who pulled himself up from the slums from a poor family. I don't even think he had his father living at home, and he wound up becoming a Harvard educated economist. And so he talks about how the housing problem can be solved very simply by less environmental and onerous zoning overregulation. He said there was no housing problem in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. People were living in every part of Manhattan. So, it was never a shortage, put it that way. So anyway, there were some policies that are government overregulation that actually bring more systemic poverty. I'm not an expert the way Thomas Sowell is or some others, but any policy that is Marxist in its nature or socialist, I suspect will bring down the quality of life. All you got to do is study what happened to East Germany as opposed to West Germany. The Berlin Wall separated them after World War II. East Germany was taken over by the communists, and West Germany by people who were more sympathetic to capitalism, and the USA, and no comparison to their economies. You see the same thing with Cuba. You see the same thing with Venezuela, once the most wealthiest, or one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, and look at it now. It's worse than what we used to call a third world country. And this kind of example could go on and on and on. So socialism doesn't work because it has to be initiated by force. It's not where people just vote for it or people do it. It's forcing people give up their private rights, and it takes away individual motivation. It forcibly redistributes wealth, and I don't think that's the biblical way either. So kingdom economics is better than socialism, communism, fascism, and capitalism. And kingdom economics is, free market, whatever you sow, you should reap, but it's not just yourself. You should use it not to look at someone as an employee, but as an associate. You disciple them to have their own business. If they have that capacity, you should produce seed after your own kind. You should release people to their greatest calling and potential, and not just look out for your own benefit. So kingdom economics transcends every economic system that's out there. Unfortunately, no nation has put that into practice, but individuals have been doing that at times.
Right, and I agree that kingdom economics, of course, is the best, but I think we get a lot of pushback, particularly from Christians and conservatives, of course, when it comes down to policies that some may deem to be Marxist or liberal or whatever. But we don't get pushback on some of the doctrine, like the Powell doctrine of the, I think, the 70s, 60s, 70s, where the teaching and the thinking that corporate America should become a lot more aggressive, unapologetic. The Powell doctrine told rich corporations, just go for it. that meant they had began to infiltrate politics. Prior to that, politics politics and corporations, there was a line that they didn't cross. Once the Powell Doctrine was presented and put into play and embraced by the Republican Party then and conservatives, they began to have a different kind of thinking about America. They began to, without apology, be unfair in their practices. They began to form associations that were designed specifically to help advance their agendas. Some of those associations, the or foundation, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, and all those kinds of institutions, think tanks, whose sole purpose was to figure out how the corporations get more wealth. And it was that kind of aggressive thing that has hurt America. There are some things that hurt some of the other nations, as you mentioned. Some of their perhaps Marxist views brought their nations down. But at the same time, America quality of life has also depleted greatly, and it is attributed not to Marxist policies, but rather to those conservative Powell Doctrine type of approaches where corporations and the wealthy and all that they have been the more aggressive, more destructive part of American society. They have contributed to the diminishing and the diminishing of the middle class. They have caused all kinds of problems. But Americans, I feel, my opinion, Americans have been propagandized so much so until we begin to not even talk about that. We don't even mention that. We don't even think that. We defend more the rights of corporations to continue destroying America, even at our own expense. We defend the rights of the rich and super rich to continue destroying America with the thinking, we've been made to think that somehow or another, one day you too can be a 2%er. One day you too will be a 1%er as long as you protect the rights of the 1%ers or 2%ers. And they introduced class warfare and all those kind of. They began to attack, America as was known by the good old days, the 50s, right? As was known by many Americans. It was those policies that began to undo it. They began to attack. They took issues with unions. They took issues with other entities. They made Americans who were even part of the unions, who were benefiting from unions, made them to begin to think that the unions were doing a bad thing. So they dismantled unions, or whatever the case may be, and began to have a more difficult time. And then the job began to leave the country. All these things happened not because of any Marxist or socialist policies. These were at the hands of Americans, American corporations, the super rich, and in most cases conservatives and Republicans. And I'm not into parties. I don't get too much into the party thing, but that's just the reality of it from my perspective. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think there's crony capitalism where big companies and corporations receive handouts, bailouts. We saw that in 2008. There are some corporations that were deemed too big to fall. Well, what about my small business, or if I'm a pastor or whatever, So I think there is crony capitalism, but it also has benefited people on the left. George Soros has got an amazing amount of handouts with taxes and favors, and even people like Jay-Z have received, a lot of Hollywood liberals have received incredible tax benefits and handouts from or favors from administration. So I think there's cronyism on both sides. Again, whoever's in power or whoever the ultra rich favor, they're going to manipulate the system. So it's definitely not just the left or the right. It's human nature, and human nature is selfish, narcissistic. Whoever's in power is going to try to stay in power or help those who perpetuate their power. And I think, again, that's why we need kingdom economics. We need kingdom entrepreneurs, people who are not just going to look out for their own benefit and who are going to empower the most people. And then you have the globalists, you have people from the UN, you also have people in the CIA that that have a lot of influence with maybe 6 of the major companies and corporations that control much of the world's economy, like Disney and others, that have a lot to say, that even control a lot of the news. So there's a lot of stuff that we're not even talking about. That is, we just see the tip of the iceberg. But if we just look at the news, we're going to be captured by groupthink. It's going to take a lot of analyzation, a lot of going beneath the surface, and really seeing that what we think is truth is not always the case. There's a lot of some of these people are just puppets of someone pulling the strings. So there's no question in my mind there's crony capitalism, and there's also big companies that really don't care. There was a special that I saw, a documentary that had to do with Teflon and how they continue to perpetuate chemical plants that were harmful to drinking water, killing people, causing cancer, and a lawsuit still going on, I think, today. And the Teflon pans are probably still being sold. So this, if you have enough money, you could lawyer up, you could continue to perpetuate your own system or corporation, irrespective of whether it's good or harmful to the environment or the people at large. So yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of that going on.
Mm-hmm. One last thing before you go, and I'm going to ask you if you would comment on how what we can do as Christians, and particularly Christian leaders and pastors. What can we do to begin to impact legislators, organizing among ourselves, that kind of thing? Your commentary now. You've done a great job in New York of organizing pastors and Christians around a lot of major issues. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the most important thing is just to show up. I remember I started a political social movement in 2003. It was made up of people who were Democrats and Republicans. Some voted for Obama, some voted for McCain in 2008. So we weren't left or right. We were Christian, and it was called City Action Coalition. And we eventually created a PAC, ran people for office. And we would go regularly to Albany. And they said, why did it take you so long? We would meet with assemblymen, with senators. And they said, we call you guys the firecracker crowd. You make a big stink when something happens, and then you never come back. And so we hired somebody to represent us. They were constantly in Albany, and we paid them a salary, and we were constantly bringing people. I was bringing a lot of black bishops with me to Albany from different parts of New York City, and we got to know these people, and we basically tried to influence legislation. So what I've learned is you got to show up, and it's not just getting elected to office. That's a lie. Not everybody's going to have the money or the stomach to run for office, but you could volunteer. You could be part of the staff. You could intern. We could train our young people to be interns for political leaders. And I found that the interns and the people who get hired and the people who are part of their support staff influence public policy, because these political leaders are too busy to even read the mail, to read the legislation that comes across their desk, and they're constantly getting input. And the only ones showing up are those who most of the time have anti-Christian views that are giving them advice. When the church abandoned culture about 150 years ago in the late 1880s, we're paying the price now for not having a voice at the table. So we need to get back.
Can I suggest that perhaps, I think the church, particularly the conservative evangelical church, has had a voice. They participate but they participate differently. They have certainly, had the voice in the ear of conservatives. They've been a force to be reckoned with, and for that reason, I think they have, and I would say, we've been complicit in some of the. Hey guys, wrap ups on the line. They've been complicit in some of the policies that we see that are unfavorable. Listen, we are about out of time on radio, so I want to thank our radio audience for being there. Pastor Josh, before we leave, I'm going to let you. Please close us out and let Pastor Matera have final remarks.
Yeah, Bishop, could you just share quickly on your latest book Jesus Principles. And also next week, our guest is Will Ford. I know you had him on your Thursday global leaders gathering. And just let our audience know a little bit about Will Ford, if you could, since you know him a little more than I do. So just, please enlighten us on our newest book, Jesus Principles, and Will Ford.
Sure. Yeah, the Jesus Principles came out in October. You could go to my website, Joseph Matera, that's 2 T's, MATTERA.org, josephmatera.org, and there are 12 books for sale. Jesus Principles is on the very top of the website, and it's about how Jesus released greatness in people, basically how to have a disciple-making movement after the model of Jesus. I think it's an amazing book. I think it's a practical book, not just for leaders, but for anybody who wants to understand the process God takes them through to release them to their assignment. In terms of Will Ford, I just met him recently. I was on God TV with him, and he has a kettle that was given to him by his ancestors. And this is a huge kettle that he carries all over the country, where the slaves would pray and they would put their heads in this kettle. I think it was called the Kettle of Tears or something. I can't remember the exact name, but they had to put their heads in this kettle in order to pray, so that their so-called quote-unquote master would not hear them pray, and they would be punished. And he talks about how God has used him to be a reconciler, how he has worked with people who are former descendants of slave owners, and God has used him and others to be a voice for racial reconciliation. I think he was part of the One Blood movement. So he's a teacher at Christ for the Nations, a learned man, a very humble man, and you will not be disappointed when you have Will Ford on your show next week.
And thank you, Bishop Matera. And we were definitely not disappointed as well this week. And I just watching some of the comments, people were really blessed by what you had to share, and we were blessed as well, and we really appreciate it. Thank you, Bishop Joe.
Thanks
to
to
Bishop
both
Gandy
of you
as well.
Thank
Keep
you,
up
sir.
the good
Appreciate
work.
having you.
Let's stay in touch. Love you guys.
Thank you so much.
Love you too.
Love you too, sir. God bless.
All right. Bless
All
you.
right. Thank everyone for being there today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Pastor Josh. Great conversation, great discussion, great guest.
Amen. That's so too. Thank you.
Yeah. So WEHA, thank you for being there. We'll be back on next week, same time. And those of you on Facebook.
WEHA, Port Republic, Atlantic City, and now on FM translator 100.3 W262CF, Atlantic City.
Hello, this is Martin Luther King III. There is a deadly pattern of injustice in Donald Trump's America, where communities of color are being ravaged by the COVID crisis, where innocent young men are murdered for jogging in white neighborhoods, where we live in fear of the police because of the color of our skin. We need to elect leaders who understand that African Americans aren't treated equally or fairly. That's why I'm endorsing Amy Kennedy for Congress. The Kings and the Kennedys have always believed that every American should be able to have justice, and for generations we've stood side